Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome to the first episode of Finding Your HR Advocacy Voice. My name is Tracy Justice, and I will be your host over the course of this conversational series that I will be having with Chris Schrader. But before we jump into let me go ahead and bring Chris on before we jump into the icebreaker. Um, Welcome, Chris Schrader, to the stage.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And so before we jump into the formalities, Chris, what we're going to go ahead and do is start an icebreaker just to kind of give everybody at least 5 minutes of time to get into the room and get situated. And so I am going to put that icebreaker on the stage. And so just for some 5 minute fun, we welcome you to the room. Thank you for being here. And we hope that you'll join in and engage with this icebreaker. We'd be delighted if you tell us who you are, tell us what you do, and here's a fun stretch to HR advocacy, right? Because sometimes we get stuck in our left side of our brain. Just to kind of bring some creativity into some fun into this. If HR advocacy was a fruit, which fruit would you describe your thoughts or feelings? Would describe your thoughts or feelings on it and why? And then get a little creative, add an emoji to share what fruit would describe what HR advocacy is for you. So, Chris, as people are, as our attendants are coming in and dropping their comments dropping their information in the comments, I'm going to share with you what my fruit is. And so, my fruit would be a pineapple. I know, and it's kind of crazy, right? Because when you think about it, you're like, well, why a pineapple? Well, because when you look at the outside of a pineapple, it doesn't really look attractive, right? It just looks a little bit rough, right? Like there's a lot going on. But once you make it to the center of it, you realize that there's some sweet stuff going on. Now, yes, there's some texture. It can be a little, there's some things going on there, but it doesn't change that it's sweet. Sometimes there's sourness, but it's sweet. So, Chris, I'm going to ask you, what's your fruit?
That's interesting. I'd never really thought about that before. I would say probably closer to a watermelon. Pretty big,
Okay.
a lot of consistency to it, but an awful lot of seeds you have to work your way through. Just like with the pineapple, the center of it is indeed sweeter. But you have to get through the rind, but then you have to avoid it once you're there. So, yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that watermelon. And I was thinking, like, I wonder what other people are going to say. So as you're joining the room, welcome, welcome. We welcome you to the room. We'd be delighted if you tell us who you are. Drop it in the comments. Tell us who you are. Tell us what you do. And then answer this question. If HR advocacy was a fruit, which fruit would describe your thoughts or feelings on it and why? And we challenge you to use emojis if you can to share your fruit. So what we'll do is we'll open this up for a little bit. I'm hoping to get some engagement, but no pressure. If I'll let about a minute go, and then we'll just jump right into bios and introduction. Just want to make sure that nobody misses any of the meat. So let's see. Okay, well, that's okay. So what I'll do is that just so that we're not wasting time, I guess, wasting any time in getting into the meat of it, I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about myself first, jump into a bio. And then if I start to see comments, I'll definitely share that and add that to the screen. So first, I'll start with who I am. So Tracy Justice, and not only am I going to be your host over the series of this conversational series, over the course of this conversational series, but I'm also the CEO and founder of Be Bold, Be You, LLC, which is a HR, human capital strategic planning, executive coaching, training development, mastermind think tank company. And I know it's quite a bit, but what I ultimately do is I work with leaders who are wanting to be bold enough to challenge their own BS. Right? I'm going to take it there, Steve. who are bold enough to challenge their own BS, and so that they can create powerful shared visions that bring people and communities together to do great work. And I like to make a joke with the BS, but truly BS means belief systems, right? Because what we believe can truly get in our way of moving forward for the success or the goals that we're moving towards. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chris, share his bio before we go ahead and get started. So you have an idea of who we are, right, as you engage in this conversation with us. So Christopher Schrader is Director, Government Affairs for HR Indiana SHRM. He chairs the Healthcare Policy Committee and serves on the Labor Law Policy Committee at the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. Yes. He is also president of Schrader and Associates, a full-service HR management consulting firm focused on helping small and medium-sized business excel and grow. Prior to starting his own company, he worked for several firms in the publishing industry for more than 25 years, holding leadership positions in operations, sales, accounting, and human resources. Okay, we're doing a lot here, aren't we? Now, Chris grew up in a politically active family. Both parents ran for office at one time or another. He has testified many times before the Indiana General Assembly. He is a frequent visitor to the Indiana delegation in Washington, D.C., and has developed solid Capitol Hill relationships over the last 25 years. So you can tell why I've invited Chris over to this show to help me with this series, right? Now, Chris holds a degree in political science from Indiana University. He is certified as a senior professional in human resources by the Human Resource Certification Institute. So there is your bio. Chris, is there anything else that you want to add to it that I probably missed?
No, I think that was sufficiently complete for what we have. Yeah.
And so we did get some comments in the room. So I'm going to go ahead and share the first comment. So hello, Hillary Kanye. So if I said it wrong, I say it again, Chris. Kanye. Okay. Well, welcome to the room. So you are an HR generalist. Oh, so, okay. So you can't think of a fruit, but I'm going to throw out what comes to mind. Onion. What?
I love that. Thousands of layers. I like
thousands. You know what? I love that. Thousands of layers. And you know what? And here's the thing. There's no wrong or right answer. This is just all about your creativity to just kind of think outside the box. I love that. There are so many layers to advocacy. And as you peel it, you realize it makes you want to cry a little bit. But, you got to feel it. You got to feel it. Right. So, and yes, all the layers. Right. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for being in the room. We are so happy to have you. Here we have another comment from Tiffany Ewing, Assistant HR Director. Okay, so a fruit, I really don't have a great analogy, so I'll toss out. I don't, you know what? The emoji did not appear on here, huh? Just because I like them. So real quick, Tiffany, if you don't mind telling me what it is. So I guess I was not expecting the emoji to not show up, but that's all right. We're not going to let things like this stop us. Oh man, but I would love to see. Okay. Blueberries. Okay. So blueberries. Ooh. Okay. Okay. So I'll toss out. Why does public, does advocacy sometimes make you blue? I mean, I definitely can understand.
If you've ever picked blueberries, you know how difficult it is because the plant itself can be kind of prickly. So you have to be careful when you're harvesting that fruit. So she's probably thinking about, you can get something sweet, but you have to avoid thorns.
Oh, I love that, right? Because it's not going to be all sweet, right? Like there's going to be some sort of challenges to this, but that's what makes it fun. Right. That's what makes it fun. Oh, I love that. Okay. So let's see. So thank you so much, Tiffany Ewing, for being in the room. Oh, you're laughing already. So Shar Paycheck, thank you so much. Oh, my gosh. God bless you. Thank you so much for sharing that, helping me with your last name. I'm an HR consultant. I would say a banana, right? Sometimes it's smoothie. Ooh, and other times you'll want to split. I love that. Oh, that's super good, right? Like, I love that. I love how we're bringing like a fun energy to public, to HR advocacy, because it's not always easy. Definitely not. I love that. I love that, Shar. That is awesome. And so here's what I was telling Chris earlier: is that you get me. I love to talk. Chris, Chris and I, we both love to talk, and we'll probably just talk throughout this whole thing, just talking about other things. But I do not want to do that. I definitely want to get to the meat of it. So you're going to see at times I'm going to be looking down at my list just to make sure that I am staying on point. So, so here's another thing that I guess I wanted to make sure that I got that I shared. So let's take that down. Okay. I want to share our disclaimer. And I think that it's very important that that we get this out here, because although, or maybe I didn't share this with you yet, but I am not only am I the host and CEO and founder of Be Bold Be You, but I've also volunteered my time, talent, and treasure to the local Indy SHRM chapter as the director of government affairs. And so because of that, and because Chris is also the director of government affairs of HR Indiana SHRM, what I did want to be respectful of is that since this is not necessarily coming from SHRM, I just wanted to, be respectful of that and just make sure that I'm transparent with this. So this podcast is provided for community building. We're hoping to build community, educational purposes, and public policy awareness. It's neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of policy. Reference to any specific legislation or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by Indy SHRM and HR Indiana SHRM. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on this program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity that they represent, right? So the views and opinions expressed by Indy SHRM and HR Indiana SHRM volunteers are those of the volunteers and don't necessarily reflect the view of Indy SHRM and HR Indiana SHRM as a whole. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, definitely please contact me. Chris, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think that's pretty thorough.
Okay, so let's move along. Okay, so another thing I kind of want to put out there is just, and this, we're not going to have a slide-driven conversational series here at all, but I definitely want to make sure that the things that we need to talk about, I put it out and I'm transparent. I definitely want to make sure that we keep in mind that it's about the policy. It's really about the policy. Like, Chris, add to that. It's about the policy.
Well, I think, actually, I think a real good observation of former governor of Indiana, former President Purdue, Mitch Daniels, used to say, and I really affiliated with it, was that when you have good policy, it makes for good politics. And so you have to be careful about policy.
Definitely. Thank you. And then another thought to keep in mind is that HR advocacy is really about coalition building, right? Like, so we're not all going to always agree on every single thing. And that's really not the goal of HR advocacy. What we hope is that we're able to find the commonalities that we do agree on, right? And Chris will probably talk about it later as we get into the conversation, but we want to protect the HR toolkit, right? Like that's what, we want to protect that HR toolkit. So we know that it's about getting together, and we know as HR professionals what makes public policy work for us, how it supports our work, and how it sometimes works against what we do as HR professionals. We know that there's power in numbers, and so that's why we want to come together and build community. We respect differing opinions. And so, like mentioned earlier, we're not always going to agree, but can we embody a spirit of curiosity and open-mindedness and allow our questions to come from that space, right? I feel like, once we're able to do that, we'll be able to learn exponentially. Chris, is there anything that you want to add to that?
No, it's fine.
Definitely. Okay. Super cool. So ask questions, right? And whether you're a novice or an expert, we can always learn something new, right? So if you ask your question, somebody else in the room will be able to see things from a different perspective, and then their world gets to expand, right? So definitely be bold, ask your questions. And to let us know if you have a question, this really is if the comments become very flooded, we want you to put QC so that we know that you have a question or comment, so that I can look for that comment and add that to the screen. And we can definitely make sure that we address your question and have it answered for you. But when it's slow, don't worry about it. We'll get that on the screen. We'll get that answered for you. So let me see if there's anything. Oh, okay. Then we're going to jump into the conversation flow. So we're about get ready to start. So I just, since we've kind of went through a few things in the beginning, we're going to get ready to start. What you can expect for the rest of the show is that we're going to talk about what are the structures of government and how does it function, right? And then we're going to get to the part of what's good to know right now, rules and public policy, and what you can do about it now, right? Because there's so much going on in the news and what's going on in DC and how that impacts what's going on in the state of Indiana. And so Chris is definitely going to be able to help us with that. And then we'll touch on HR votes, which is a great platform for HR professionals to get plugged in and figure out, who's your legislator, who are your lawmakers in your jurisdiction, and to check on whether you've registered to vote. And so we'll get through all of that. So, all right. That was a lot. We are at 4:16. So Chris,
yeah,
let's go ahead and start it. What are the structures of government and how do they function in terms of HR advocacy?
Sure. Well, when you think about the structure of government, you have to really go back to the United States Constitution, right?
Okay.
The form of government that we have back when we created it was extraordinarily radical. And I would argue it still remains so today in many regards, and is, more than a few countries model their governments after parts of how we do it. But the backdrop against the Constitution coming together was that the states that existed following the Revolution, they knew they had to come up with something to work together well. They came with the Articles of Confederation. It was a good first attempt. It didn't work at all. And then they began to work on the Constitution, which was not easy to get passed because it created a federal government. It created a central power. And this was not looked upon kindly by most of the states at the time when it was first being pulled together. After all, they just fought a war against a central power, right? And so they were supposed to be independent states. And how was this all going to work? And so what was created out of that was a federal structure that is actually quite loose in construction in this regard.
Okay.
The federal government has certain powers articulated in the Constitution, but those are really limited and they're articulated. And as a matter of fact, so terrified were the founders of concentrating power in any one area that they set a government and put a government together that would, quite frankly, put all of the pieces of it just in normal operation, pretty much in conflict. And this was done by design, not by accident, but by purposeful design. The states were terrified that a federal government would just run amok and eventually just cancel out all of their hard-won liberty. And so they built it the way they built it. So they broke it into four pieces. Okay. So the first piece is the House of Representatives. And they created responsibilities for the House of Representatives. And unique to the House, there are 2-year terms in the House, which means that representatives have to basically constantly run for re-election. That was designed to make the service, quite frankly, fairly onerous. Most people could not take, any more than 2 years out of their life to provide public service, and no more than Congress paid back then. So it was seen as, civic duty, right, to do that. It certainly wasn't economically beneficial to do it, but
definitely
they
not
set it up
economic.
for 2 terms. And so that basically means that a congressperson who wants to stay in office is just constantly running for office, right? Just short. The other thing that they did was they put responsibility for the budget, all matters of budget and everything in spending and all of that has to originate in the House. Okay. So it has a unique power in that regard. And they set up the House to be for its members to be directly elected, meaning the population would vote for those representatives, right?
Okay.
They then created the Senate. Now the Senate has 6-year terms. This was done by design. Also, they expected the Senate would be populated by, quite frankly, wealthy people people who had the ability to take 6 years out of their lives and somehow still make a living,
Yes.
right? So they
Sometimes I
anticipated
feel
that.
like that's still the case, Chris,
Yeah,
but yes.
yeah, it very much is. That's not
Yeah.
far off the beam at all, because it's true. I mean, you're unplugging yourself, really. As a matter of fact, typically they put their affairs in blind trusts and things like this, and so it's not the easiest thing. But they set that up for 6 years with the intention being that the House would be the place where the popular will of the people would be would first evidence. They expected the House to take on things that the population was really concerned about. And they set things up in the House so that things could be put together relatively quickly to
Mhm.
reflect the people's will. And then it would be sent to the Senate, which Madison referred to as the cooling chamber of the hot legislation coming out of the will of the people. And the senators, having 6 years to wait for an election, could afford to do something unpopular, right? Because it would be
Yes.
a number of years before they would stand again. And that they would then mollify or modify that and then send it back to the House, where presumably cooler heads may prevail. And then you can get a piece of legislation that could come out. But even that
Okay.
wouldn't be enough. Even that wouldn't be enough. And so they designed the executive. This is in the United States, the executive office is the presidency.
Okay.
And the executive office is the reason they call it the executive is because fundamentally, and if you look at the Constitution, the primary duty of the president is to execute whatever it is that Congress did. Right?
Okay.
That's their job.
Mhm.
That's that person's job. And they granted that person veto power, which meant even if something came out of the House and the Senate, that the president could veto it. And then they also set it up by the rules that if the bill came back to the Senate, which is where it would return, right? Because it goes
Mhm.
House and then Senate and then to the president. That the House that the Senate would need a 2/3 majority to override that veto. So they made it even harder for a piece of law to pass, right? Because an executive could just spike it.
Just veto
So
it,
you
yeah.
can see by design, and this is what it took to get the other states to agree to the Constitution. By design, they made it pretty clear that they didn't expect them to get much done
Hmm.
because they designed a Rube Goldberg device to make it happen, right? So, from my standpoint, I'm not surprised that oftentimes people get frustrated that not much is done. What I'm surprised by is how much does get done against that backdrop. I mean,
Okay.
it's a pretty arduous task. And then, just in case something did slip through and the president did agree to it, they put the Supreme Court there to be able to sweep in at the end and say constitutionally this isn't permitted, and we spike it. So they put tremendous safeguards in place. And then after they enumerated the powers of the government, it still wasn't enough. It still wasn't enough for the states to sign up. And so the Constitution was passed only upon the agreement that the first 10 amendments to it were accepted. So they voted in, the states voted in the election, and then they turned in immediately past these first 10 amendments. And these
Mhm.
first 10 amendments are what are called negative rights. Okay.
Negative rights.
Negative rights. So the difference between negative right and a positive right. I'll give you a real good example.
Uh-huh.
The let's see, what is it? 21st, what is it? 29th, I think, amendment that gave the right to 18-year-olds to vote.
Okay.
Okay, that's a positive right. They weren't allowed to vote
Oh,
before. That was a positive right. They were granted that by an act of Congress. A
okay.
negative right means something that the government has no right to touch in the first place. That's a negative
Oh,
right.
okay.
Okay.
Huh.
So that is why, and the First Amendment, of course, was the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, everything. And that's always been the lightning rod, right, for constitutional cases, right? Where people will
Okay.
argue. As a matter of fact, we just had a Supreme Court case last year involving the post office, where a person made an argument under the First Amendment that their right to observe their faith was being infringed by the federal government in the form of the post office. And the Supreme Court agreed 9-0, which is what the Supreme Court usually does on religion stuff. At least this Supreme Court has done 9-0.
Yeah, because they're not going to touch that.
No,
Yeah,
it's a negative right. See, that's a really high bar.
Huh.
When something is established as a negative right, that's a super high bar, right? That is oftentimes, and I'll use the Second Amendment, right? The right to keep and bear arms. This is one oftentimes a lot of people have strong opinions about, but the law always goes in the favor of, when it gets to the Supreme Court, it always goes one way. Yes, they can. Because it's a negative right. Now, people could, I always see people, arguing that and complaining about that, but that's a negative right. When something is a negative right, that's an almost impossibly high bar for the government to climb over. And that was done on purpose. And so to me, one of the most important amendments is the 10th. It was the last amendment on the Bill of Rights. And this is the one that basically says, okay, we have enumerated the powers of the government. And we have listed out all the things the government can't touch to begin with.
Okay.
Just in case we forgot something. If we did, it doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to the states and the people that reside in them. So what we have to remember is that we are a loose federal. It's a fairly loose federal construction of 50 independent states.
Okay.
So that is the baseline structure of government. Now, as a condition of joining the Union, so once the Constitution is passed, all of the new states coming in had to agree to observe the Constitution of the United States. And they also basically had to construct their government more or less the same. So in Indiana, we have an executive called the governor. We have a General Assembly that has a Senate and a House, and we have a Supreme Court. And every state has a version of that, where the only exception being Nebraska, that has one assembly chamber. They call them all senators. So they don't have a House, they just have one assembly chamber. And I think that has more to do with Nebraska having like 5 people in it than it does anything else, right? But that's an outlier. Everybody else, pretty much that came after that, absolutely duplicated the design of the federal government in terms of the design of their state governments. And so they work very similarly. Now, another thing that happened with the construction of the executive office is they said, there's probably going to need to be some cabinet roles. They identified a postmaster, they identified a secretary of war, et cetera, right? So, I mean, they laid some things out, but they didn't want to write that one so tight because they couldn't see the future, right? So they had no idea how big the executive would be. And Lord, is the executive large now, right? So you have all these federal agencies. Now, this is something that's very important when it comes to advocacy to understand.
Okay.
From the advocacy standpoint, you can always directly advocate for your interest directly to your elected official.
Okay.
You always can, right? And that's the right of free speech. That's the right of assembly. That's all these other things, right? So enshrined in the #1 amendment, right? So you can do that. But when it comes to the executive branches, you can't, because they are under the executive office itself, right? And as a result, how they interact with the citizens is very different. So I'll give you a real good example.
Okay.
The Department of Labor is in the last leg of rules. They've created a rule dealing with an update to the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, having to do with the salary floor for exempt positions, right? And so they want to raise that to a significant number in comparison to where it is today. There's a specific process for it. And within that process, they are required under law to take public comment.
Yes.
Okay. And that takes the form of writing. So it's not like you could roll into Washington, D.C., go into the office of your representative and say, I want to meet with him or someone on staff. And you pretty much would unless they weren't there. right? Because you're a
Yes.
constituent,
Yes.
you can do that. An HR professional can't walk over to the EEOC, knock on the door, and say, "Hey, round the commissioners up. We need to have a chat because this isn't working."
Okay.
That's illegal. That's
Okay.
illegal. Okay, so you can give them comment if they solicit. So they have to solicit. They
You
have
have
to
to
ask.
solicit.
They have to ask, and so if they ask for comment, then you can do that. And all of everybody pretty much on this call, on this podcast, I think that's attending, I think is a SHRM A team member. So SHRM will oftentimes
Okay.
craft the comment and then send it out to the members and say, "Hey, if you're cool with this, hit send," and boom, that goes off to the EOC or the DOL, wherever it goes. Occasionally,
Real quick, Chris,
yeah,
if you don't mind, I definitely want to I definitely want to highlight what you just said, because I think that that's such an important point, that when we think about advocacy and thinking about the different agencies, so the executive branch is what I'm hearing you say, is that you can't just meet with the elected officials as
they aren't elected.
they aren't elected because they're somewhat private.
No, they
No.
report to the President of the United States. They are
Okay.
under the authority, and they are a creature of the executive office. So everything we think of in terms of these federal cabinet branches, Department of Labor, the EEOC, the IRS, I mean, all of these organizations are line up under the executive office, and those people are appointed. The senators and the representatives, and the president, him or herself, is elected. Okay, but those other people are appointed by the president because they are organized in the Constitution under the executive office. Okay,
that's really key.
So
Yes.
So those rules are different. So they solicit. Now they're required to solicit. Okay, they're required to ask. But again, that takes the form of written comment. Now they can also, and they have done this, they can also say, "Hey, we want to hear direct testimony." So they will go out to stakeholder groups on certain issues and say, "Hey, bring us experts, and we want to have them give testimony, and we want to be able to question them." And that happens quite frequently also. Right.
Okay. So just to kind of go over a little bit what you said, that there's 4 branches. There's the House of Representatives, which is a 2-year term.
Well, there's the legislative, which has 2 houses.
Okay, the legislative has 2 houses. This is great because, which I did not add in the beginning, is that because I consider myself very new in this, and I look at Chris as just very, he's the expert in this. We've had conversations talking about what the structures of government are and how does it function, and it's a lot. It's a lot. And I think that sometimes as an HR advocate, if we're thinking about, advocating in this space, just having a better understanding of the structures is going to help. And this helps me a lot. So thank you so much, Chris, just kind of clarifying. So there's legislative with 2 forms of,
with the Senate and the House.
With the Senate and the House. And then the executive, and then the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And then the logic of the government was that a free press would be the quote unquote 4th estate, right? That you hear them say that from time to time. I would argue the founders probably not envision the Senate not giving a dog for what the House thought, and vice versa. I don't think they saw that coming, but that they more or less do act as 4 separate branches rather than just a legislature, an executive, and a court. So yeah,
definitely.
That's why I made that comment. Their actual function is like 4 instead of 3. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But it's really 3, but it feels like the 4th. Okay. Okay. Because I was going to say, I just learned something new.
3, but it acts like 4. Yeah.
Okay. Because I was going to say, wait a minute, this is not what we said before, but okay, I totally get where you're going with that. Yeah. And so where, based upon, what you said about the structures of government and how it functions, how does a brand new person, right? So I think that sometimes when, like, even for me, I'm not as new, but I'm still new. But when we get into this, it's easy to kind of understand where you're going with what you're saying, what you mean, what it means. But what about the brand new person who wants to get involved? Considering the structures of government,
Well,
Where's a perfect place for them to start?
well, I think, well, we left out one other thing. I talked about the
Okay.
state governments, but there are county governments,
Yes, there
which
is.
more or less work the same. They have
Yes, I
county
even ran for office in that.
yeah,
Yes. Yes.
you know what I'm talking about. And then there are also city governments, right?
Yes.
They'll have a mayor and a city council and all this. So we have a lot of government. So kind of
Say it
one thing to
again.
think about is where do you want to interface with it? Right.
Okay.
And heck, I didn't even begin to talk about the different agencies like school boards, which is usually where people are really involved, right? And those are elected too, right? So we are
Yes.
foreigners, for Lord's sakes, and none of us know
You
anything
said,
about
oh, coroners.
foreigners, yeah, with no voter knowing anything about forensics, right? But
You
anyway, but my point is, we have a lot of government. We have an
yes, yes.
awful lot of government. We vote for almost everything, even when we don't know who these people are. But I think the first thing to decide is where do you want to interface? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you want to interface? So do you want to work locally? Do you need to do something relative? Maybe the city's coming up with an ordinance that you're not really in favor of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happened in Bloomington a few times, and my local chapter has taken opposing viewpoints on that. And in those cases, I've worked to persuade the council and the mayor to do something different, and sometimes with success and sometimes not. But you can do a local basis. Same thing happens at the county basis.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing happens at the state level. Now, one of the big differences between the state level and Congress, you might not run into your congressperson shopping at Kroger, but you probably will state and Senate representatives. The difference will be you won't recognize them when you see them, but they're there. They are there.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you said that, Chris, because like I've seen senators and local senator, and they'll walk into the coffee shop, and I know one of them is just like, "Hey, Tracy," and he's just wearing shorts, and at first it's like,
yeah,
who are you? Oh, because you're not in a suit. I don't know who. Yeah,
correct.
Definitely, yes,
correct. No, that's a big difference. Yeah, and you also have to take into account timing of things. So, for instance, the Congress. The federal Congress pretty much stays in business year round. I mean, they do have some breaks, right, to allow the representatives and senators to go back to their districts to work, and usually they do that. They meet. I know the last time the Senate had a break. Both Senator Young and Senator Brown came back to the state, and I think covered darn near every county in the state the time they were back. So. That's work too, right? It is.
Yes, definitely.
It is voting because you got to hear what's on people's minds, right? I mean, that's where you got to do it. So, but let's take the Indiana legislature as an example, right? Well, they're not a year-round legislature. California's is, but we're not, and most aren't. We have a long session. As a matter of fact, let's look at Indiana's Constitution, as this is an anomaly. Indiana's Constitution actually only calls for the legislature to come to assemble once every other year, primarily to do a budget, and then they're supposed to go home. Now
so the bicentennial.
Yeah, you only go. Texas does that. There are a lot of states that do that. They come every other year. You show up and you do a budget and you go back. And I think Tennessee works that way. Yeah. So. That's
good to know. That's good to know, Chris, because I guess I didn't even know that the federal level was year long.
Yes, it just doesn't stop. Yeah, just doesn't stop. Well, they run. Congresses run for 2 years, right? And then there's elections, and then there's new Congress, right? But at the state level, that's where it's supposed to happen. Now, there is a provision in the Indiana Constitution that the legislature can meet more frequently than once every 2 years. It can meet in an off year, provided that the governor declares an emergency and says the legislature has to convene. So the state never had an emergency that any governor was willing to call them back for most of the state's history. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Civil War didn't rate as sufficient criteria to declare an emergency and have the legislature come back. Met only twice during the war, right? But But since 1959, we've been in a perpetual state of emergency. And so every year, every off year, the governor signs a decree that says we're in a state of emergency, and the General Assembly is called back, and they do what is called the short session. So they can only be in business for about 90 days.
90 days.
Yeah. So this session that just ended was the long one, the main one, right? Went all the way to the end of May, pretty much. And this next one that we have starting in January will end in March.
In March.
Right. So you have to take into account kind of also what's going on.
Oh, right. So real quick clarification. So sure. So what I'm hearing you say is that really what we could be doing here in the state of Indiana is that it would be a bicentennial meet
if
for
there
the
wasn't
budget.
An emergency.
If there was an emergency. But what the governor's been doing is enacting.
Since 1959, every governor did.
What?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well,
just for those who are on here.
Let me explain. It's not crazy. Okay.
It's not okay.
Here's the reason they do it, right? The fact of the matter is, well, first of all, this is another thing the framers were worried about, and they were right to be worried about. And I say this as an educated political scientist. The nature of any government structure, okay, I don't care what it is or where it is, the nature of it is to grow and aggregate power and to intrude into more and more and more areas, right? Where government
expand.
Expansion. Needed, right? And just like companies try to expand to acquire more market share,
territory,
customers, right? This is human nature. This is just human nature writ large within the environment. So there's a constant pressure to grow government, and then there's, Lord knows, there's always things that government is interested in that thinks it can do something about. And so therefore it tries to create an agency or go into that area. Okay. And that was permitted over time. So the blunt fact is that the Indiana government has become too large and unwieldy to merely get everything done that it needs to get done every other year.
And you know what? I think
there's not enough time. There's not enough time. And so having said that, in the short session, because the time period is so short, you usually do not, it's very, very rare to see truly substantive legislation roll through in that off one, because typically legislation like that needs funding. Right? If it's a duty for the government to perform, well, there's got to be money behind that to happen. Or if there are tax implications, then there's got to be money that comes from somewhere to either offset that, or there's got to be cuts. And that can only really be accomplished in a budget year, right? It can be accomplished in a budget year. And so usually what they use the short session for, a big piece of it, is they have a lot of what are called technical correction bills. Okay. And these are bills where, you'll read the bill and it will say technical corrections to Indiana Code 24F, Section 7, page, this and that, line 64, word 15, A is changed to the. I'm not kidding.
Like whereas.
Those kinds of things. Yes. And the reason they're doing that, because what's happened is that after a law passes, there's a lot of back and forth and horse trading that goes on and restructuring of laws. And it's not unusual for what's left to not be exactly correct. And so then lawyers will look at it after it's passed and say, hey, wait a minute, that's not the right word. Or that's not the right sentence. This doesn't make any sense with this. The intent is that, not this. And, but you just can't, hop on Word and do a search and replace and bang, you're done, right? Because that law was passed, which means you have to pass a new bill with all those corrections and all those changes to then modify the bill that was passed. And then that's got to be signed off on and everything else. And so there's an awful lot of hearings and votes, all this stuff that I pay no attention to. Because that's just everybody fixing stuff.
So I'm going to ask you a question just to make sure that I'm following and I'm understanding,
Sure.
because sometimes my mind just goes. So with the technical corrections, for example, I know, like, sometimes we talk about the FMLA and how the FMLA is just sometimes it's just annoying to implement, because just sometimes it can be confusing if you don't have the right
Or you mean
software.
because it's
Mm.
counterintuitive and poorly designed?
Oh, right,
Oh, okay.
definitely.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Go ahead.
definitely. That.
Yeah, go ahead. All right. Go ahead.
And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
when, so if, as HR professionals, right, because I think that sometimes we think about advocating for, if there's going to be a proposed policy or proposed rule, and we'll advocate, but can we even, get together and even advocate on technical corrections, maybe a technical correction to the FMLA?
Yeah,
Does that even make sense?
that's been like the holy grail of HR since in
Oh.
the past. I mean, HR fought for 20 years for technical corrections to
Okay.
FMLA because, like I said, written in a way. Yeah, we tried, just couldn't get across. But I'll give you a real good example. I'll give you a real good example here of something that SHRM is advocating for right now, that I also have advocated for. As a matter of fact, when I was on the Hill last week, I was talking about this,
Yes,
and this has
yes.
to do with Section 529 plans, right? So most states have Section 529 plans, and everybody sometimes they're marketed by different names and things, but basically what they do is allow parents and kids and friends and neighbors and relatives to kick money into a fund
Okay.
that the state will not tax them on, and the federal government's not going to tax them on it, provided those monies are used for the post-secondary education of a child. So think about it. The easiest way to think about it is if it were a 401k for college. Think about it.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
So easy to understand, right? Put the money in there, all the tax shelter value, you can invest it, it can grow, all that stuff. And as long as it's used for post-secondary, again, college is the thought.
Yes.
You could do that. Okay. So that's why those things were created. That's how they were created. And that's how they've run. Now, SHRM and number of other stakeholders, this is a pretty broad coalition of people who are asking. We want Section 125, Section 529, modified to permit those monies to also be used to pay for professional licenses, to pay for trade schools or things other than college, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things like that, to expand it. Now, the reason that needs to happen is because unless those become allowable expenses,
Yes.
then the IRS is going to look at it and say, well, you can do those things if you want, but now it's all taxable and everything is taxable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, this does not require budget money. Again, the funding for these are self-funded, right? This is people kicking in money to these things. So there's no budget implication to this bill. It is
Yes.
purely, or rather to this code, this section of the tax code. It's literally just add these elements so that the IRS will then leave people alone, when they turn around and use these funds for these purposes.
Yes. Yes.
That is a form of technical correction, but
Okay.
it requires legislation to do that, right? The IRS isn't going to enforce anything different unless Congress passes something that says something different, that modifies that code. Okay. So that is an example of something where there's a correction, but it doesn't have budget implications.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. And I love that. And I just want to give a shout out to SHRM, right? Because that's forward thinking, and to all the other stakeholders that, came together and to work on this legislation, because it's so forward thinking, right? Because back in the days, it was all about just college, right? That was the main thing. But now we realize that there's just different ways for people to make money. And I think this is a great way for people to invest in themselves. So I love that, right?
So that's just an example, like I said, of what.
Yeah, just an example.
A technical modification. Think about it that way.
Yes.
The modification of an existing element of code.
Yes. So we have about like 10 minutes left. And I kind of figured, and no pressure, that we were kind of depending on the conversation, how, it would.
Well, I didn't answer the question about how I started to answer the question
about the FMLA.
How you advocate. That was what you were asked, and then I dragged you off in a different direction. I apologize.
No, it's okay. So, we're having a conversation. That's what
figure out where you go, understanding that the form and the shape of government is roughly the same, based on whatever level you're working with. And if you're comfortable working at the city level, because that's important to you and that's where you live and that's where you work and that's where your employer is, well, then I guarantee you there's an elected representative that that is in your area that you can talk to, right?
Yes, an elected official.
Same thing
So
at the county level, same thing at the state level, and same thing at the federal level, right? And the
yes,
key thing to remember when you're dealing with people that you are a constituent of, right?
yes,
The good news is they will treat you like what they believe you probably are, a voter. So
yes,
you will get a response, you will get engagement, right? I mean that stuff will happen because they certainly want to pay attention to their constituents. Almost all these people take their jobs very, very seriously. They see themselves as public servants and doing the best they can to exercise the will of the people within their judgment of what's the best way to do that. And this is again why, like I said, why advocacy is so important. I didn't say it before earlier, but to me, what really struck home with me are the words of Thomas Jefferson, right? When he was talking about when he was describing the Constitution, because people had a lot of questions, right?
yes.
And Jefferson said, we're not in the United States. We're not ruled by the majority. We're ruled by the majority that participate.
Yes,
and so if you don't participate, you're not in the majority that decides things.
definitely.
And so that's why I always say that you could stand on the sidelines and let everything go, or you could
definitely
get into the mix, right? And you don't have to go full hardcore. Right? Don't have to do it like you. Don't have to do it like me. Right? We're in roles.
That's right. That's right.
That kind of require that, but that's not what everybody has to do by any stretch. And again, shout out to Sherm. The way they've set up the A team, they do a lot of the heavy lifting, right? I mean, if you haven't followed and aren't completely up to speed on the minutia of the proposed rule change on the salary floor, well, Sherm's hard at work pulling together that response, and they'll send it to you. And literally all you have to do is click and say, yeah, click the box, send this to the Department of Labor, and boom.
Definitely.
You've done. And they're required under law to read those things. I don't know if you knew that. They're actually required to read that stuff.
No, and I think that, you've even said it before in a conversation where if it's not you, maybe somebody else, but I think it was you, that even if, if the current administration is not reading that information, the next administration or the next administration after that can definitely pull those records and even use that.
Well, and I will tell you, I honestly believe, and I've seen firsthand evidence that they do change things, right? So let me go back to the salary floor, okay? So the Department of Labor actually took the extra step of holding what they called stakeholder conversations before they ever actually put together a rule, right? And so I was fortunate enough to be invited to participate in one of those stakeholder conversations. And at the time, the salary floor they had in mind was about $80,000 a year.
Yeah. Because it's about 60 right now. Like, the proposed,
they're proposing 55. They're proposing 55. Yeah.
Okay, around that. But,
but yes.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Okay.
That was like their starting point about what they wanted. And I shared with them, my point of view of what would happen if they actually did that. What would be the implications within HR that likely very few people would therefore be exempt. People would be hourly. That whether it was right or fair or not, it really wouldn't much matter. You'd have millions and millions of people who would feel like they'd been demoted. Like they were right back to punching a clock, a job that they thought they'd worked themselves out of, decades ago.
And then most people who make, salary, who work a salary, tend to work over the 40 hours. And so I can definitely see, what is overtime going to look like?
Think about it. If you're in a non-exempt role, mean, you probably don't have decision-making authority. Again, you would,
Yes.
I said, this would, what I told them was this would lead to a practical stripping of millions of workers' identities at work by
No,
government BI.
definitely. Now, Chris,
And that you need to be
I'm going to
darn
pause.
careful with that. Yeah. So at least they didn't do that. Right. So they came
Yes.
off of that. And
Yes.
I wasn't the only leaf on the tree on that. Everybody on the call was letting them have it. But that's an example of, no, that's what I'm saying. They did change their minds on that.
And I mean, and it takes, and I think, because we do have 5 minutes left, so I kind of want to wrap up, but I think this was perfect, to these stakeholder conversations, because I think that what that represents is that as HR professionals, our voice does matter, when it comes to public policy making. Most of the legislators don't have a SHRM or even an HRCI or any kind of, HR credentialing to support their knowledge. And so our voice is just so key. We have to be at that table just to make sure when we think about interpretation, administration, implementation, and down to compliance. I mean, that's just a lot that impacts the work that we do as HR professionals and impacts the community, the business communities that we serve. So, just because we're ending the conversation a little, we definitely are going to continue the rest of this conversation in our next episode. Chris and I will work on the dates and kind of get that finalized, and we'll send that information out to everyone. But just to kind of wrap up what we talked about today, we looked at what are the structures of government and how does that work. We're thinking that for the next one, we can really kind of maybe focus on how HR professionals can really start to find their footing in all of this. Maybe a place to start. What do you think about that, Chris? What do you think for next week?
I think that, but I think it's also important, I think, to understand. Probably do have to talk about this. What some of the practical barriers are to that.
Okay.
One of the things I typically hear is, I don't know how you do it. They're totally crazy. The whole system is broken. They can't get anything done, et cetera. And when I hear expressions like that, that tells me right there that person perceives this just to be an insurmountable barrier. Like there's no way I even want to get involved in that, because the whole thing just seems totally insane.
Yes, nuts, chaotic.
And I think next time, probably what I want to talk about, because this is an important thing to understand. Sherm says all the time, and I completely agree with this: policy, not politics.
Yes.
Policy, not politics. However, I will also tell you that politics is the means by which policy passes and gets enacted. And you can't simply just sit on one side of the ledger.
That's right.
And be effective. So if you can't understand how the politics works and why they work and how they work, it's going to be hard to really be truly effective. So
honestly,
I think,
yes.
I think I want to spend the next conversation pretty much kind of decoding that and demystifying it for people to see how that is, because the fact of the matter is that things all happen for a reason.
Yes.
And oftentimes it's not the reason that people are told, or necessarily what the news says or the talking heads on TV say. They oftentimes have their own agendas and things like that. So I think a lot of that is the part of advocacy that I think turns people off, because it feels sticky.
Yes.
And it feels icky.
Yeah, it does.
And how many people sign up for that, right? So I think I want to talk about that and demystify that, so that folks can understand that actually is navigable.
Definitely.
You just have to have a decent understanding of it. So Okay.
And I love that because that's what it's all about, bringing education and awareness
Yeah.
to the whole process. And so
Good.
what I wanted to share real quick, we are up at the hour, but I wanted to share this real quick because Chris had, in a way, not really alluded to this, but he talked about this, right? Know who your lawmakers are, and, and maybe try to reach out to them or see what they're doing within, whether it's local, state, or federal. So this is a great site. Chris, do you have anything? Because I was on the webcast last week and I saw this and I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't know that there was something like this where for HR professionals, you can go check on check on this platform and you can see your own voter information, where you can go vote. I mean, just so much information to get us ready for next year. And so, is there anything that you want to add about this? I don't know if you know any more than I do.
Do you have the actual link for that? I don't.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Thank you. You know what? I am going to drop the link. Where is it? Okay, I'm going to drop. Ooh, no,
There
not
you
there.
go. Oh, you have.
Well, I'm actually gonna
if we have the emails of the participants, why don't you send it?
And I'm definitely gonna put it here in the chat as well. Let's see how that works.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So hopefully this shows up on here. Okay, super cool. Okay, so you know what? I'm going to take it to the next. This was really fun, Chris. Thank you so much for doing this with me. For those who want to log off, I definitely will respect that. But I just kind of want to give some last minute, just a shout out and just appreciation to Chris, because when I first got into the role of Director of Government Affairs, first year, really excited about advocacy, but not quite sure where to start. SHRM does provide a lot of great resources. But what I realized is that as my job as the Director of Government Affairs is to find the community, engage the community, and engage in conversations. And Chris has just been generous with his time. We've been able to connect and talk about public policy and what that looks like in the HR space. And I thought, you know what, I can't be too greedy and keep all of this information to myself. I mean, I've got to find a way to share this with other people because we've got to get involved. Because if we're not getting involved, somebody else has the power to make the choices that impact our life and what we do. And if we're not going to just give your power away to somebody else. Just think about it. If you're not involved, you are giving your power to somebody else to make the choices for you. Okay. So Chris, you know what? We're going to share the love. So from Tiffany Ewing, we love Chris and appreciate all his knowledge and support. Right. Like soon. And I hope I'm not embarrassing you, Chris, but I just want to say thank you. And we're excited for this journey. And so, yeah. So
I was going to say, I really look forward to our next conversation. And, as you said, we'll get that pushed out. I'll work on a date and get that set up. Okay.
Definitely. Thank you so much. So for everyone, tune in. We'll share details on the next episode. And thank you so much for being a part of our conversation today. Oh, Tiffany, fan club, right? Fan club. All right. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Very good.